Winter, 1894. Salle-Léonard de Port-Maurice, Quebec. A boy of 18 stood at the edge of a snow-choked road and watched a grain thresher chew through a wheat field on the other side of the fence. The machine swallowed stalks whole and spat out separated grain in a clean, continuous stream. Mechanical, inevitable, almost beautiful. Arthur Sicard looked down at the road in front of him, buried under 4 feet of compacted snow, impassable, isolating his village from the rest of the world for the 3rd week in a row, and had a thought so obvious it almost hurt. What if you could do that, but with snow? He was a farmer's son. He had no engineering degree, no wealthy patron, no institutional connections. What he had was a single image burned into his mind, a machine that could swallow winter whole and spit it somewhere harmless. He would carry that image for the next 31 years. Quebec winters in the late 19th century were not an inconvenience. They were an emergency that arrived on schedule. Montreal, already one of North America's major cities, shut down in stages every December. Horse-drawn plows pushed snow to the sides of roads, creating walls that narrowed streets to single lanes, then half lanes, then passages barely wide enough for a man on foot. The snow didn't disappear. It accumulated, it compressed, it became its own geography. City workers removed it manually. Teams of men with shovels loaded snow onto horse-drawn wagons that hauled it to the St. Lawrence River and dumped it in. It was slow, expensive, exhausting, and perpetually insufficient. By February, some Montreal streets sat 8 feet below the level of their own sidewalks. The city was not paralyzed. It functioned. But it functioned the way a man functions with a stone in his shoe, by absorbing a constant, unnecessary cost that no one had yet decided to fix. Every winter, the same number of men, the same number of wagons, the same tons of snow moved by hand to the same cold river. The system worked because it had always worked. That was both its justification and its problem. Sicard understood this problem in his bones. He had grown up inside it. And from the moment he watched that thresher in 1894, he believed he knew how to solve it. The principle was straightforward. Time equals 450 milliseconds / greater than a rotating auger at the front to break up compacted snow, a powerful fan behind it to accelerate the material, and a discharge chute to throw it clear of the road. 3 components. 1 continuous motion. The machine would eat the road and leave it clean. Straightforward in principle, ruinous in practice. Sicard spent his 20s and 30s building small prototypes, refining calculations, approaching manufacturers. He worked as a milk delivery driver to fund his experiments, a detail that would have been humbling for a man of lesser conviction, and that was probably humbling for Sicard too, though he never said so publicly. The route started before sunrise. The same streets every morning in the same winter dark. The horse knew the way, which left Sicard's mind free to run through the geometry again. Auger pitch, fan diameter, chute angle, the exact relationship between intake speed and discharge distance. He was, in a sense, engineering on company time. The company just didn't know it. The banks were not interested. Neither were the investors he managed to reach. The objections were predictable. Too expensive to build, too. Specialized in application, no proven market, too ambitious for a man without credentials. Some were polite, some were not. One manufacturer reportedly told him his idea was a fantasy, appropriate for someone who had spent too many winters outdoors. He kept going anyway. The rejections followed a pattern that anyone who has tried to fund an unproven idea will recognize immediately. First, the polite interest. The meeting taken out of courtesy, the drawings examined briefly, the questions asked without real curiosity. Then the hesitation, the request for more data, for a working model. Time equals 3 milliseconds / greater than for proof that cities would actually pay for this. Then the door. Always, eventually, the door. What the pattern never accounted for was a man who simply refused to stop returning. By 1920, he had a working design on paper, sophisticated enough to be taken seriously by anyone willing to look closely. The problem was getting anyone to look closely. He was 44 years old, self-educated, without institutional affiliation, pitching a machine that would cost thousands of dollars to build to solve a problem that cities had always solved with shovels and manpower. The shovels and manpower lobby was, in its own informal way, surprisingly effective. In 1925, the town of Outremont, then an independent municipality on the island of Montreal, agreed to watch a demonstration. It is worth pausing on that word. Agreed, not invested, not funded, simply agreed to watch. After 31 years of closed rooms and returned drawings, what Sicard had finally secured was an audience. He understood that was enough. He only needed them to see it work. Sicard arrived with his prototype on a February morning. The machine was ungainly, loud, time equals 300 milliseconds, greater than, and visually unconvincing. It looked less like an engineering solution than like several pieces of farm equipment that had been persuaded to work together. Municipal officials stood at a cautious distance. Then he turned it on. The auger bit into a bank of compacted street snow. The fan accelerated. The chute rotated. A clean, white arc of snow flew 27 feet through the cold air and landed in a pile well clear of the road surface. The machine moved forward. The road appeared behind it. Officials who had arrived skeptical found themselves doing calculations in their heads. Cost per mile, hours per block, winter seasons remaining in their careers, during which they would no longer have to manage 200 men with shovels. Outremont placed an order. The contract was modest. The machine cost roughly $13,000 to produce. For Sicard, who had spent 3 decades working toward this moment on a milk driver's wages, the number was almost secondary to the fact of it. Someone had finally said yes. Sicard founded his company, Sicard Incorporated, the same year. The timing was fortunate and slightly brutal. North American cities were just beginning the automobile transition. Time equals 4 milliseconds, that would make snow removal a genuine civic emergency rather than merely a serious inconvenience. Cars didn't navigate snow-packed streets the way horses could. They needed cleared pavement. The demand that Sicard had spent 31 years trying to convince people existed was about to become undeniable. Orders arrived from Montreal, then from other Quebec municipalities, then from cities across Canada and the northeastern United States. The machine was refined. The discharge chute became adjustable. The auger became more powerful. Models were scaled for different road widths and snow densities. What had taken 31 years to begin took less than a decade to spread. Cities that had managed winter with bodies and shovels for as long as anyone could remember switched to Sicard machines with a speed that made the previous arrangement seem almost inexplicable in retrospect. It always looks that way. The solution, once visible, makes the problem look avoidable. It was avoidable. By about 31 years. By the mid-1930s, the Sicard snowblower was municipal infrastructure.